Hello and welcome to GREENFLEET Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today. I'm delighted to be joined by Simon West Oliver, who is Sales and Business Development Director at AssetWorks. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Kate.
Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for giving me the time.
Today, Simon, we're discussing the transition to electric. I think it would be helpful by way of introduction if you could tell me a bit more about AssetWorks.
With pleasure. So AssetWorks are a global organization. We herald out of the US, North America. We have something like 575 clients globally. We manage a fleet of assets across those clients of about 14 million vehicles. And we have about a 97% retention rate on customers. Specifically, we are a fleet management workshop and stores provider, very strong in the public sector area globally, but we have clients in every viable sector across the world. Great,
thank you, Simon. So one of the things that has been quite topical in the last year has been the issues around vehicle supply and the impact that that has had on waiting lists for some fleets. And as a result, they're having to run their existing vehicles for as long as possible or look for other solutions. What problems does that raise and how do you see the issue resolving?
I think the issue is going to take some time to resolve, without a doubt. I think for lots of organizations, they're looking at a plan to transition, and a plan to transition involves acquisition of these types of assets. The delay in the supply is forcing, I think, lots of these organizations to extend the usage of their current fleet for as long as possible. And what we're seeing amongst our clients is that they've placed orders that are now running out now into a year to 18 months before assets going to start to arrive. What's interesting, that has actually given them time to start planning their infrastructure. The process has slowed down a little bit, which has enabled them to look at, it's not just acquiring these vehicles, it's actually providing charging facilities for them, making sure they acquire the right type of assets to fit the right type of roles within their business. So to a certain extent, in some respects, it's worked as an advantage for some organizations. For some of our larger clients who are buying in large volumes, it has caused a quandaries that they've got assets that they want to run off now off their fleet and bring in new vehicles. And they're having to now look at ways of filling that short period of time with different types of assets. So they're looking at some form of extended usership of certain assets, which doesn't do the environment much good, because it means you're running older vehicles for a longer period of time. Therefore, your maintenance costs go up. The pollution impact can actually increase. So to weigh that down a little bit, they're looking at bringing vehicles in on a short-term basis. Now that may be a rental type operation that they may be working to cover that short period of time. But I think we're probably 18 months before we start to see it balancing out. But because the demand is so great now amongst organizations who've got this firm end date in their head, and we haven't come across an organization that hasn't got a policy of how they're going to manage this. What we're getting organizations that are trying to manage the frustration, and they're managing the frustration by this extended usage period, and looking at those key vehicles that they can actually replace by doing some form of internal rental process to replace them temporarily before the real asset that comes onto their books starts to appear.
Great. So the internal rental then is potentially the first time that they have had an electric vehicle on their fleet or in that particular function.
Correct. Yeah. And again, people think, well, we're going to replace our ICE vehicles with electric vehicles quickly. There's a whole load of things that go around that. As I've mentioned, the charging infrastructure is another issue for them. But the other thing is actually driving an EV vehicle is very different to driving an ICE vehicle. So this
Oh, yeah.
period of time is allowing them to also transition their drivers into those vehicles. They have to be coached, they have to be trained how to drive an EV to get the best out of that EV, especially when it comes around to the range these vehicles can operate in.
I think your point about using this extended time period to deliver on the infrastructure is quite an interesting idea, because we know that the infrastructure doesn't come in overnight.
No, and it's not straightforward.
No, it never is. When we think about so it used to be that range anxiety was the biggest barrier, and to some extent, with bigger batteries, we've seen that range anxiety become less prevalent. But there are still challenges with the public charging infrastructure around ease of use and convenience of charging. And how do you kind of see that's going to play out in the next few years?
Well, if today it is a major issue. If the fleets were to increase EVs by volume rapidly, okay, that charge infrastructure nationally isn't there. And I think, for lots of various different local authorities, they're looking at their internal fleet, and I don't think they're looking at it as a provision for the public. Okay, and if you're looking as an operator, you're going to be looking at vehicles, and again, I've got to provide my own internal structure for charging these vehicles, but then I've got to be able to map out for my operational team where they can get charging, okay, throughout a working day. And again, that has some impact on the assets that you're buying and the assets that you can easily replace today. So when organizations are looking at their fleet replacement, they should be looking at those that they can replace with current availability, okay, based on their operational activity, and that the charging infrastructure is available for the routes those vehicles are going to be used in. And I think that's the issues, the three key issues that lots of organizations need to take on board when they start to look at these types of EV changeovers. I think the other problem we've got is that for lots of local government is they should start to be viewing this as a revenue generator, okay, rather than just going, okay, we now need to provide this EV functionality as a cost of actually finding the appropriate areas to put them, because they need to be close to routes, and that's the other issue they've got, is that there isn't the land availability close to the traveling routes, which has to be taken into consideration. So then do we create remote EV charging areas that are a little bit away from the routes? So you look at some of the parking systems that were placed for out of town parking, again, to reduce ICE vehicle usage in inner cities. They should be the areas where they should be looking at putting in lots of EV charging capability, and encouraging people to use those facilities and making them revenue generating, which again helps with actually funding the infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed. And we are starting to see, I think, certainly on the strategic road network, we are seeing some out of the box thinking, probably more so from the private sector than the public sector at the moment, in terms of locations that are maybe half a mile from the strategic road network. But it's an interesting challenge, definitely. And for fleets who have, a lot of fleets now already have a net zero plan in place. But I always have to ask, because I don't want to leave fleets behind, what about those who are only just starting this journey? Where should they begin? How should they tackle this transition?
It's interesting. We help lots of organizations transition, working with many of our clients today. As it works, a little bit unusual in the fact that we actually supply not just the core fleet management infrastructure to manage the transition from ICE to EV. We also provide the management tools and the infrastructure tools to enable somebody to transition completely. So we'll actually supply an EV charging site for an organization, which is fully integrated into our back office solutions. So it's a full cradle to grave operation. But when we're talking to organizations that are just beginning this journey, they have an idea that they've got a holistic fleet of X number of vehicles, that they've all got to move them onto different powertrains. We actually try and slow that process down a little bit and say to them, right, there are three areas you need to consider. What is the current valuation on those vehicles? What is the normal replacement schedule for those ICE vehicles? Which vehicles can you replace sooner rather than later that are going to have the lowest impact on your budget? Okay, and which are the vehicles that in that array that you've got that you're thinking of replacing, there are available assets in the marketplace that you can acquire that fulfills the job function of that vehicle.
Yep.
Okay, so these are things that we need to consideration. We have a tool to help them plan this. The other thing that we tend to sit and talk to clients about is can you supply the infrastructure? Okay, have you put together a plan for how you're going to transition your drivers and how you're going to skill them up so to reduce the range anxiety issues so they get the best performance out of vehicles? And try to avoid them putting vehicles into high usage areas where there's going to be a high with low charging capabilities.
Yeah.
Those are the things that we're trying to get our clients to do at the first stage. But the first thing, if you're going to start out on that journey, is to go have a look at the total cost of the assets that you own already. Have a look at what your normal replacement periods are, and look at the vehicles that you can replace sooner rather than later, and then plan for those vehicles that impact the budget at a later stage. Plan for those replacements in smaller edible amounts, if you like, in ways that the business can afford to do it. Most organizations are pretty forward thinking, and most of the organizations we're working with are keen to hit those key dates when they can actually say from an organizational perspective, we are a sustainable fleet, we are a full EV fleet, or we are operating alternative fuels within our whole organizations. For lots of people, this transition doesn't just affect the vehicles, it affects their whole business. So as they move to that transition to being a more sustainable operation, it's not just around the vehicles as well, it's holistically their property management, how they manage the fuel within their business, how they operate individually within the organizations. And the pandemic has had a bit of a play on that, with more of us not actually going back into the office. Organizations are starting to restructure around that, which is having an impact on the acquisition process of assets.
Yeah. Sometimes there's a big question mark over entire locations as a result of COVID and different working patterns. I think a lot of what you're saying in terms of the pressure to be sustainable and transition is stronger within the public sector because they are potentially operating under different timelines and they've got climate emergency and all of those kind of things. But a lot of what you've described strikes me as this permanent tension between CapEx and OpEx within a business and how they've historically structured their fleet business and how they need to transition that to zero emission.
Yeah, I think today we're starting to see organizations work up to the concept. And again, I think it's been driven out of the pandemic a little bit. It's accelerated that move from ownership to usership. If you start to look at most organizations and saying, okay, you've got a number of vehicle assets there, what is the length of time they're actually being used? And they suddenly start to realize that, hey, we've run a business for 18 months without actually moving assets. And those assets have had to be moved. They've not been at the level of usership that we thought they were going to be. Have we got too much asset? Okay. Do we need to look at how we share that asset? And so we're now starting to see models where it's organizations are looking at, and partly again, it's driven because of cost. We'll look at rental modules, subscription modules around moving key individuals, especially in the public sector, So instead of operating huge levels of grey fleet, we'll operate a EV subscription fleet internally that people can pick up and use that type of asset for their operational journeys when they do need to travel. If you look at the necessity of other types of assets, you can't operate that way. So you're looking at a snow plow that is a seasonal vehicle, but do I need to own it the whole year round? And if I do, can I rent that asset in more effectively? And if I do own it, can I rent it to somebody else more effectively? So we're now starting to see that back-to-back type activity start to happen. And that really does lend itself well to looking at, I don't want to take the RV hit on an EV vehicle that I'm unsure about what it's going to be worth in 3 to 4 years' time.
Yeah. It's just a totally different way of operating a fleet and thinking much more holistically, as you've said, about your assets and how they're actually used to get the best possible value from them. I have one last question for you, Simon, which is vans, electric vans. Okay. Now I love a van. Lots of people love a van. The latest data from New Automotive shows that in July, 5% of new vans registered in the UK were electric, with 93% still being diesel. So what more needs to happen to really see this tipping point on electric vans in the same way that we've seen it in the passenger car market?
Well, I think you partly we answered this question already. It's the capex opex issue here, okay, and it's that fear that I'm operating vehicles in a certain area that if I put them into put that operation, part of the operation into an EV fleet operation, the range issues are going to start to be a problem to my business. Okay, so with most organisations, I think it's that winning that confidence to say I can actually replace a traditional ICE diesel van with an EV. And again, this is about strategic planning. Okay, you take the routes where you know you've got the charging capabilities and the operational capabilities, and you put your EV change there first. Then if you start to look at the shorter journeys, the stop-start journeys, where you have the biggest impact on your EV usage, or where there is less charging capabilities. Because if you look at it's the downtime's the issue for lots of organisations. Yeah. That's why they're still buying diesel vehicles, is they're going, this vehicle is on a shift pattern. One team comes out of it, another team comes into it straight away. Do I need to then have 2 vehicles if I'm going to run EVs instead of 1? And no, what you've got to do is look at the charging when that vehicle's static during its day operation. Yeah. And I think once we solve that properly for organisations, I think we'll see a rapid increase from ICE into EV, and that 5% will go in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, we are seeing the range improving in vans, which I think will help. I think I understand why this is challenging. The frustration is that actually the more miles that vehicle is doing, more electric miles, the bigger the impact on the carbon footprint, but also the bigger the TCO benefit, because your pence per mile is lower than it is for diesel. So it's this complexity of, well, it's the long range vehicles that people are reluctant to switch across, but ironically, that's where the biggest environmental and financial benefits will come.
Right. Yeah.
And the sooner we crack that nut, the sooner we'll see more vans.
Without doubt, the manufacturers, you start to see what the OEMs are doing today, and reducing, extending the range capabilities of EVs is going to get better. Of course, we can't turn it back on the emerging hydrogen impact as well.
Okay.
And that we'll start to see some of that start to help organisations transition as well, and that will reduce some anxiety. But I think on the EV side, EV's here to stay. Okay, the manufacturers have heavily committed into it. Okay, it's dramatically changing how we approach driving. as individuals, as private individuals, as well as business operators. And it's going to rely on that change of thought being right the way down at driver level of how they operate one of these vehicles, and organizations planning better, route planning better, built around charging capabilities and managing their businesses different.
Yep.
It's a change for all of us in every direction.
I couldn't agree with you more, Simon. And this change does need to happen, because I think it's highly unlikely that any fleet is going to get to 100% zero emission without making some operational changes to how they run their business.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Simon, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. That is about all we've got time for. Thank you to Asset Works for joining GREENFLEET Talks, and thank you for watching. Please join GF365 again soon.